Boardroom Bound, episode 144, exploring the opportunities in private board roles with Scott Roulston.
I have this belief when it comes to finding boards, or that very often the boards find you and you don't find them. It happens by being visible, by being able to express yourself in terms of what you might bring to a board. And the only way that really gets out so that the board can find you is when you interact with other people.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of Boardroom Bound. My name is Alexander Lowry, and this is the podcast dedicated to intentional leadership in the boardroom. My goal is to give aspiring and existing directors the tips, tactics, and strategies necessary to transform your confidence and build a successful career as a board director. Quick reminder, you can get all of today's show notes at podcast.gordon.edu. In today's episode, we're speaking with Scott Roulston. Now, Scott has served on 3 public company boards. He's currently the board chairman of a public REIT. He's been the trustee of a major public pension fund and served on several private company boards, also several big industry association name boards that you would know as well. This is someone who's kind of been all across the spectrum, and we're going to hear about those today, a little bit of compare and contrast, and give you a sense of what options could look like. Really good fun. Let's jump into the episode. Before we jump into today's show, I'd like to share a message from our sponsor about director certification. Want to join your first board, or are you looking for additional board seat opportunities? In either scenario, be sure to be disciplined in your approach. Now, through the Becoming an Exceptional Board Director Candidate Coaching and Certification course, you get both modern board director candidate packaging and modern board operations knowledge integrated within one program. Remember, the key to landing additional or your first board seat is in your packaging. Make the effort to do it right. Program graduates also receive their globally recognized International Board Director Competency Designation upon course completion. It's designed for individuals and groups. You can learn more at bit.ly/IBDC-D. That's bit.ly, bit.ly/IBCDC-D. And now let's jump into the show. Scott Roulston, welcome to the Boardroom Bound podcast.
Thank you, Alexander. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Well, I'm excited for our episode today because we share some similarities in our background. We were joking that before it started, but you have such this fascinating, wide range of experience about so many different types of the board space. This is going to be a great example for audience. They have places that they could go into. They might not have been considering maybe how to be successful in some of these sort of compare and contrast, the looks and the feel. There's so much to cover. This is great, but it's really important that we understand your background, not only in financial services, in your career trajectory, and then we'll talk about how those set you up for the different types of boards. Maybe we can begin just by telling us a little bit about your career and where you've ended up today, because that's also a very important position.
Sure, Alexander. As you mentioned, I've had a fairly broad career, been fortunate to work in the asset management, investment management industry, and more specifically, over the years, the wealth management space. It's been a very dynamic industry. It's one that well, quite frankly, one of the reasons I get into it is because I feel good about doing good things for other people. Not to mention we have a fiduciary obligation in the financial advisory business to put the clients first. So most of my career, my day job has been in the wealth management industry, helping people plan their financial goals and execute toward those goals.
And when someone were to step back and look at your board resume, it's incredibly impressive, the stuff you've got here. It's hard to know for someone like, how did all this happen? How did it come about? Can you tell us about your first couple of board experiences? Because eventually you realized, well, this looks like a portfolio to me, but how did it start?
Sure. Well, I think like most people, I got involved in not-for-profit organizations to start out. And quite frankly, a lot of not-for-profit organizations are looking for donors, but with that donor relationship comes usually some advice and some feedback to the management of the organization. But I was fortunate enough to pretty quickly to get into some board work with some private companies, some companies that were invested by either wealthy families or private equity money. And those were really interesting situations in a variety of industries. I was involved in a healthcare business, a company that worked with devices that go in the operating room of hospitals. I worked with a software company in Findlay, Ohio, that was in the early cusp of financial accounting software many years ago. And then I got involved in a fascinating company that was really a startup that converted vans to be wheelchair accessible. So a company called Mobility Works in Richfield provided these vans to folks who were buying vans for their loved ones so that they could achieve some mobility, or commercial lines, things like provide rides, nursing homes, and so forth, that needed to transport people who were wheelchair bound. So that was a variety of companies that were in the private sector that I got involved with. Sometimes those were just through friends and acquaintances, and sometimes it was through the investors in those companies.
And so you had some private company board experience, and you've also checked off a box that probably just about everybody listening to the show wants if they don't have already, the public company boards. A lot of people are looking at that. And they're public company REITs, and they're public REITs. Mm-hmm. How did these come about? So the first one, you had a whole good amount of board of experience. How did that first one come about?
I was involved many years ago in a manufacturing company that was a public company. It was a small listed company with a low market capitalization. But you're right, around 2004, I got involved with a company in Cleveland that owned and operated shopping centers. And in 2004, I went on that public company board. It was an interesting time to be on a REIT board. And what we did was we grew the company, but then, of course, we had the headwind, so to speak, of competing with online, Amazon, and the like, and really that whole industry became very challenged. The board of that company, about 3 years ago, decided to do a strategic move to split the assets into two buckets, with the idea that we would be realizing value with a strategic decision to basically split into two companies. And I went with one of those split companies, and I'm board chairman of that REIT today. And we own shopping centers in the continental United States as well as in Puerto Rico, which is an unusual place to own shopping centers right now.
And I should be very clear, we've already talked about private company boards we started. We're talking about public company boards now. And I believe when you were started right about the same time from that public REIT, you were also on Charles Schwab's advisory board. So another sort of giant, big bucket, professional industry type boards. How did that come about?
Yeah, when I was running a wealth management business, the Schwab organization decided that they wanted to get regular get-togethers with a group of basically their larger clients to get client feedback, but also to get a sense from the perspective of these registered investment advisors or financial advisors on where the industry was headed so that they could better serve that industry. I also was on a board of another financial organization, and it was a similar situation. They were looking to get perspective in providing their services. And I worked with TIAA CREF, which is a very large asset management firm that really focuses on the not-for-profit industry, teachers, and other educational institutions.
And working at it in higher education, they're an organization that I know very well. So those are some very...
and that was and those were both non-paying jobs. Really, quite frankly, the benefit was not only to the organization, but for me personally, it was to get to know peers in very elite firms in the wealth management space. So to really access a broader network that I might not have otherwise come in contact with if I hadn't been on that board.
but also wonderful credibility and networking purposes, if I call it that, which for anyone seeking a board seat, those are very important things.
Right, and sometimes, when people aspire to be on a big corporate board, whether it be private or public, and in particular a paying board, you really need to pay your dues to get a feel for what's going on in the boardroom with these kind of association boards or smaller privately held companies, not to mention not-for-profit and social services and the like.
And of course, we're going to start to compare and contrast these pretty soon, but we're not done talking about the different areas that you have the experience in. So you can see these large organization names like T.A. Kraft, Charles Schwab floating out there. And then a few years after that, you were on the Ohio Police and Fire Pension Board, which is a huge organization, $16 billion or so in assets. How did that come about? What was that like?
Well, that was an interesting situation because it was, again, a kind of a friend of a friend, and it was my network. And at the time, John Kasich was the governor of Ohio, and the governor, as well as the treasurer and the state legislature, appoint investment experts to each of the pension fund boards in Ohio. There are 5 of them. And, I kind of got a call out of the blue one day from somebody who was in the governor's staff who said, we need an investment expert to be on one of these boards. The boards, by the way, were composed of active and retired, in my case, police and fire officers, as well as 3 independent financial experts. So the 3 of us who had some background in investment management provided that kind of advice to the entire board, as well as being just decision makers alongside, shoulder to shoulder, with the safety force members. It was a fascinating job because we were, so to speak, on the other side of the table, making investment decisions on behalf of the thousands and thousands of first responders, both active and retired in the state of Ohio.
And it's interesting when we think about, say, a public company board, you might generally just say, okay, we're working for the shareholders trying to maximize the value. And the shareholders in a pension fund are clearly different categories. You have people that are actively retired and already collecting benefits, retired not yet collecting benefits, workers not yet retired and collecting benefits, the future people who might come, the dependents of all of those. And it goes on and on and on. Of course, you think about the taxpayers and the state and all the other people involved. And it's sort of like all those little voices on your shoulders that are always having those conversations with you while you're going through the discussions.
That's a great way of putting it, Alexander, because it really was not just the current firefighters and police officers, and in our case EMS as well, but all of their lineal descendants who were entitled to their benefits. But you're absolutely right about the taxpayers and the public officials, because if we screwed up, that would have a direct impact on the finances of the state and the taxpayers of the state. So we had to walk a real fine line in terms of making sound investments and taking the right amount of risk so that we could get return, but also not, so to speak, blowing up the entire portfolio, because ultimately the taxpayers were on the hook for providing those pension funds by law.
That's right. And when we think about different groups we want to talk about today, we're not done setting the scene yet, because you're also working for Tom Pritzker's organization today, which is a multi-billion-dollar family office. So family business oriented, which is a different perspective as well. Can you tell us about that?
Well, the Pritzker name in the United States is a very well-named and established name going back to, generations. Probably best known as starting the Hyatt hotel chain. But in fact, the Pritzker family has backed dozens and dozens of privately held companies, family businesses, professionally managed private businesses. So the family offices invest in these private organizations and really act as a long-term partner, thought partner, and provider of capital to build sustaining businesses. And in the case of a family office, you kind of think of it like a private equity organization, but generally speaking, family offices have much longer dated visions in terms of their investment return and their need for liquidity.
And I'm sure when most of the listeners envision a family office, we're probably not picturing family investors of like the multi-billion-dollar types. That's probably not where most of us are going to be put. But when we think about private companies, if we come back to that where you started, it would not be uncommon to have second, third, fourth, fifth generation type companies. Maybe they're dealing with succession plans. When do we professionalize and start to take maybe some of our family members out, put more outsiders in? These are common things to wrestle with, and an organization that we're both very involved with, the Private Directors Association, really helps people think about not just those private company scenarios, but all of them. And I know you lead, I believe it's the fastest growing chapter of PDA in Cleveland. Perhaps you can tell us more about the organization and perhaps the value you've seen for yourself and some of the other members.
Sure. Well, I was involved myself way back when. It was actually one of the first boards I was on was one of my own and my own family. And I was second generation in an organization, and my father, who was a rather iconic name and figurehead in Cleveland, had passed the reins down to myself. I had a couple of siblings in the business as well. And somebody said to me one day, you know, if you really want to succeed and have some harmony in the family and have a successful and really professionalized business, what you ought to consider is putting together an outside board. And those were some of the smartest words I ever heard, and I'm so glad that I did form a board. But it's very daunting when you are creating that first board. How you find the right directors, do you pay them? How much do you pay them? What should the agenda look like? You know, you're dealing with a lot of confidential and sensitive information. So starting a family company board is a difficult hump to get over. And I was fortunate enough to pull it off. But the Private Directors Association today, that's what the organization does to help companies like the one I was with many years ago to figure out how to get a board in place, to professionalize management, to help the company grow and deliver shareholder value for all of the family members, rather than be just representing one or two. It really is a more comprehensive and just professional, I keep coming back to that word, way to run a business. But it's much like how private equity, venture capital, and other kinds of professional investors insist on having really good governance. So why not family businesses? It works just as well, if not better, for them than other kinds of private companies.
And there are some incredibly successful family businesses out there. So we don't necessarily want people just thinking of, say, like a mom and pop local store, but it's probably important for everybody when we envision, if you're listening to this show, what it's going to look like to land on a board seat. I think most people's minds naturally go to a public company. Like, that's what I want to do. I want to check that box, which is great. And I tend to liken it to a baseball analogy. If you work your way up through the minor leagues, single A, double A, triple A, before you land at the majors, and in some ways, public company boards might be just a perfect spot. And that's all you ever want to do, but they can usually be a really good starting spot. These are organizations that need expertise and background and need help. And it's interesting because PDA is really doing both sides of those. I'd love your thoughts on this, Scott. They're helping the members think about how I become a good board member, what that looks and feels like, but also there are probably people leading the organizations are there doing just like you did. I want to build a board. How do I find the right people? How do I figure out the cultural fit? And helping both sides of that.
Exactly. And the reality is that the number of public companies is actually shrinking.
Right.
And hence the need for board members is shrinking somewhat too. And I got to be honest, public companies, with the regulations that have gone on over the years, are a lot more checking the boxes and fulfilling compliance requirements. And private company boards, whether they be family or private equity, can be a whole lot more fun, especially if you have the right group of directors. So private mutual association with the Private Directors Association. And what PDA really can do well is not only, like I said, help like you said, help the companies find the right boards and get the right structure in place, and so on and so forth, but help PDA members get ready for the right board situation, whether it be on getting their profile up to date or their resume up to date, or how to interview for one of these situations, and just how the culture works inside the boardroom with these privately held businesses. And so PDA is really meeting a great need in a part of the market that's expanding compared to the public companies. There's no question public companies pay more, but there's reasons for that. There's can be more liability with public companies. Right. There can be other pitfalls with public company boards. So I think private companies is an area that's growing, and for good reason.
Well, another key part for me of PDA is the networking. The education is essential, but we all know the statistics are very clear about the board seats are generally filled through networks. And clearly it doesn't look the same now during the pandemic as it did beforehand. But even during the pandemic, they've done a great job doing that. And I wonder what it sort of looks and feels like for you in your fast-growing Cleveland chapter, as probably many people are coming in going, this is space I want to learn about, I want to be connected with. What does that look and feel like today when the world has changed so much from a couple of years ago for people saying, I want to get educated, but I also want to do the networking to try and land some board seats?
Yeah. Fantastic question. The education, it is what it is, and Private Directors Association, or PDA, has just a wealth of information because it's all about private company boards. And we use the term networking, and I've been thinking about that a lot, whether it be socializing or networking or something. But I have this belief when it comes to finding boards, Alexander, that very often the boards find you, and you don't find them.
Right.
And how does that happen? It happens by being visible, by being able to express yourself in terms of what you might bring to a board, the networks, the domain expertise, and so on and so forth. And the only way that really gets out so that the board can find you is when you interact with other people. That's become much more difficult in a COVID environment. But Private Directors Association, with webinars and virtual networking, has filled a gap there that meets the needs of companies looking for qualified board members. And whether you call it networking, social networking, whatever label you want to put on it, it's part of how you market yourself and get the word out so that it's more likely that board will find you.
It was interesting. We had on a prior episode, Alan Aldworth, who's the CEO of PDA, was sharing some of his story, and he talked about the large number of boards that he'd been on. He was very clear that multiple of them came to me through PDA. These were not organizations that had posted that they were looking for something. There was nothing out there, but through my network in PDA, people knew of me, knew what my expertise was, and just approached me saying, I think you'd be a fit for these board seats that I'm aware of. And in many ways, that's exactly what we would want to have happen for our reputation to precede us. We can probably envision it with LinkedIn. Not necessarily that if I write the perfect profile, people are going to find me, but they should. Like, the internet works a little bit like that. But it's about sharing your story generally. And I wonder, Scott, what that looks and feels like for you about how you sort of built this reputation up within financial services and the expertise that you bring. And we know the world has changed dramatically in financial services over the last couple of decades, and the board work for it has as well. What does that look and feel like for you in terms of an industry and the connectivity and the networking?
Yeah, I think, if you think about what is really important in the boardroom, there's a handful of things that really rise to the top. And one is trust, and one is respect, and one is candor. And I'd say domain expertise might be another one. But, for example, I talked to somebody in Cleveland Private Directors Association who has a cybersecurity expertise right now. I don't know a lot of people who have that kind of expertise. I certainly don't have cybersecurity expertise like this person I was talking to. And there are plenty of organizations out there who are looking for board members right now for people with cyber expertise. So getting the word out on that kind of expertise, I'm not saying cyber specifically, I'm just using that as an example, but being able to express yourself and interact and have those kind of social norms and be able to get that trust, be candid about what you think, be direct what you think so that you can express that and help a company management and help the company protect itself in this illustration of cybersecurity. Those kind of skill sets are becoming more and more important. You know, diversity in general is kind of the buzzword in how boards look and feel these days. Mm-hmm. But diversity isn't just limited to gender or race or those kinds of things. It is also about people who have different kinds of backgrounds, skill sets, knowledge, and that's what really high-performing private companies are understanding and executing right now, and PDA has gotten a hold of that. It's a great combination to make our private companies more sound.
So, Scott, I'm sure some people can reflect on the conversation today and perhaps a light's coming on of like, wow, I should be looking in the private space. That makes a lot of sense. And as we talked about before, there are just so many flavors within that. Even if you'd limited yourself to, I'll go on a private company board, that's still very broad. It's sort of too generic to say to someone and they could be helpful. Right. It's not really clear. How would you recommend someone to be a little more specific and figure out how they should pursue the right spot for them in the beginning of their board search career?
Well, like I said, sometimes these things just kind of come along and find you rather than you finding them. But having said that, social media, I think, can play a helpful role. LinkedIn in particular for these kind of situations. Organizations like Private Directors Association. There's another one out there called National Association of Corporate Directors. It's got a different focus more on public companies, but there are plenty of organizations like that. But I think a lot of it goes on around trade organizations and at the local or regional level these days. The other thing is that with companies more and more going to virtual board meetings, it's much easier for us to have more diverse boards from a geographic standpoint as well, where people can bring expertise from different parts of the country rather than just be limited to what is in a short drive in the car.
And I know for many board members, if I can call it, one of the upsides from COVID is the amount of time they spend traveling back and forth. Their different boards has dramatically changed. And some boards, I think every board's trying to figure out what the future will look like and how they should do things. And there are many boards saying we're never going back to the way it was before.
Yeah, it's interesting. As I talk to fellow board members, and, I was thinking about this myself, I probably saved about 20 days of the year not having to drive back and forth to meetings these days.
That's enough time to take out another board role, Scott.
That's right. That's right. I've talked to people on both sides. I think the answer is going to be somewhere in the middle. I was talking to my fellow board members on the public company that I chair the other day, and we were expressing some that we miss getting together in person, because I think when we do talk about trust and candor and being frank with each other, respecting each other, there needs to be a certain element of meeting in person to really be a high-performing board on that level. At the same time, you don't need to have every single one of your board meetings, every single one of your audit meetings, every single one of your compensation or governance meetings be in person, requiring a lot of travel and a lot of cost for the company. So I think there's going to be some middle ground here in terms of finding what's the most efficient and also what's the most effective.
Well, and stay tuned because more information I'm sure will continue to evolve on that as all boards wrestle with it. But in the meantime, when we think about organizations that are helping members figure out how to do this and do it well, PDA has been great. And I would say it's been incredible value. It's $350 a year, which is so inexpensive considering the huge amount of content that are out there. So I help lead Boston. Scott helped leads Cleveland. We both drink from the Kool-Aid, and we both put our hands up and say this is a great place to be spending some time and energy. And Scott, when I think about potentially the last word for today, if you are thinking about someone out there who's going, great, I'm in, I want to start focusing on private company boards, maybe I'll look into PDA. If you were to say one other thing that would be really helpful for people thinking about like beginning to focus on this space, what would you recommend for them?
Well, it takes diligence and tenacity. It takes a while. It does not happen right away. And quite frankly, this networking that we're talking about is a bit more challenging in the environment that we're in the pandemic. But that too shall change. And so there's not a better time to start with your networking, with getting involved in associations like Private Directors Association than now. So don't wait, get with it, because regardless of your age, regardless of your area of expertise and experience, there's need for your services out in the world of directors.
Well said. And Scott, we were delighted to have you on this show today. Thank you for sharing your insights and helping all of us to be boardroom bound. That's it for this episode of Boardroom Bound. I really enjoyed chatting with Scott Roulston. This was fantastic to hear about someone describe their experience across so many different domains. Many people think about, I want a public company board seat, and that's great. There's private company board seats. They're serving the public service area like the pension fund Scott was on. There are advisory boards like Scott was on TNA Crefts, and of course nonprofit stuff. It was really interesting to hear his experiences in different places, how they all came about, and good inspiration for us as we think about opportunities. Now remember, if you head over to podcast.gordon.edu, you'll find links to all of today's resources. And please know that the Boardroom Bound team and I are so proud to be your go-to podcast for all things that connect, prepare, and empower you to land a board seat. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss any of the high-quality content that we're bringing you every Wednesday. Thanks for joining me today. I can't wait to share more stories and strategies from brilliant business minds with you again next week. Remember to keep tuning in to be Boardroom Bound.